The founders probably did that dance when they declared.
I'm sure. That's how they opened each session of the Constitutional Convention. It was Franklin, though. Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Chris. That was amazing. All right. Good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. I would like us to turn to page 673 of the Reader. And what I want to do today is, I'm not sure we'll go the whole class. If we go just 40 minutes or so, that'll be fine. But I want to talk about Calvin Coolidge, and I want to talk about his presidency. And I want to put it into context because remember, everything that we've talked about so far over the last several classes is this movement into progressivism. And with Teddy Roosevelt, we see that the progressives define the president as being the embodiment of the American Republic. And that goes directly against the founding, which saw the legislature as the body that represents the American Republic. And so almost every president we've had since Teddy Roosevelt has been what we would call a progressive president. And you guys just remember, it's not left or right when it comes to progressivism. Progressivism can be both conservative as well as radical. And so it's something that transcends just mere political differences. But we see that very strongly with this idea, again, of what's going on in the president and the concentration of that power that we see within the presidency itself. There have really been, since Teddy Roosevelt, there have really been only 4 presidents that have all tried to do what 19th century presidents did rather than what progressive presidents did. And those presidents, not surprisingly, are 2 we've almost entirely forgotten, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. They were the 2 most resistant to the idea of a progressive presidency. But then after that, you also see the same thing, not to the same extent, but with some conviction. You see it with Eisenhower and then with Reagan. So really the only 4 presidents we've had since Teddy Roosevelt who have not been totally progressive presidents are Harding, Coolidge, Eisenhower, and Reagan. And so I want to spend a little bit of time with each of them, even though they're outliers. I think that they tell us something about what's happening, not only in the good, but also the bad. The bad meaning that we've seen these progressive presidents everywhere. So on page 673, I had asked you guys to read this speech that Calvin Coolidge had given on the meaning of the Declaration. And so this is exactly 100 years ago, right? We're just a couple of months away from exactly 100 years ago. This was given on the 150th anniversary on July 4th of 1926. And obviously we're coming up on the 250th anniversary here in just a couple of months. And so we have this from 100 years ago, what Calvin Coolidge says. And it's very important to note that he has a very good grasp on what the founding is, not surprisingly, but he has a very good grasp of what it means, what it stands for. But he also recognizes that there are these just deep universal truths that define who and what we are, that go beyond skin color or religion or creed, whatever it may be. So look at the bottom of 673. He says in that last full paragraph, "We are prone to overlook another conclusion. Governments do not make ideals. Ideals make governments. This is both historically and logically true. Of course, the government can help to sustain ideals and can create institutions through which they can be the better observed, but their source, by their very nature, is in the people. The people have to bear their own responsibilities. There is no method by which that burden can be shifted to the government. It is not the enactment, but the observance of laws that creates the character of a nation." So let's just play with that for a moment. Notice how critically important the population is. Now, we're not dregs, we're not masses, we're Republican citizens who have to behave in a certain way. And if we're not moral, If we can't control our own desires, why would we ever expect the government to do so, right? In what way? So we don't look to the government for our morality. In fact, we would be absolute fools to believe that politicians would behave in any kind of moral way. Rather, it's for us, the American population, to be the moral ones and then to restrain politicians from doing the worst that they can. And they obviously do. And we see that everywhere, right? Again, without being too political, just imagine the levels of corruption right now are so high. They're so astronomical that we can't even keep our head around them. And I think I gave you this statistic a few weeks ago, but imagine, let's just say, and it's a minimum number, let's say that we're missing $9 billion in Minnesota, which seems to be the kind of minimum number of money that's just missing. $9 billion. That's more than every Hollywood movie made together last year. That's how huge this scandal is. And it looks like California is even worse than Minnesota. So we're talking about just astronomical numbers of how much money is missing right now. And who did it go to? Where did it go? This is total corruption. And so that's the kind of thing that Coolidge is warning us about. We can't expect government to do any other. It will always be corrupt. That's the nature of government. But we can expect the American population to resist it and to do what it can to restrain the political sphere. So jump forward. The next paragraph is the most important, but I don't want to look at that yet. Jump forward to the end of that piece on 675. So the last paragraph there on 675. No other theory is adequate to explain or comprehend the Declaration of Independence. It is the product of the spiritual insight of a people. We live in an age of science and of abounding accumulation of material things. These did not create our Declaration. Our Declaration created them. The things of the Spirit come first. Unless we cling to that, all of our material prosperity, overwhelming though it may appear, will turn to a barren scepter in our grasp. If we are to maintain the great heritage which has been bequeathed to us, we must be like-minded as the fathers who created it. We must not sink into a pagan materialism. We must cultivate the reverence with which they had for the things that are holy. We must follow the spiritual and moral leadership which they showed. We must keep replenished, that they may glow with a more compelling flame, the altar fires before which they worshipped. So again, notice what matters here. It's great that we have material progress. Nothing wrong with that. Right? That's a very healthy thing. But we don't worship the material progress. We acknowledge God who allowed us to have that material progress, and we don't become blinded by those material gains that we've had. So now turn back to page 673 in the bottom, and here we get to the most critical aspect of Coolidge's argument. And I love this. This is one of those passages that once I read this, as I was basically not much older than you guys when I first read this, the whole founding made sense to me. It's like the whole of the founding, everything from Franklin to Adams to Jefferson to Washington to Dickinson to Wilson, all of these guys, these very interesting but very diverse guys, they all kind of made sense once I read this paragraph. And look at what Coolidge says there. About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. It is often asserted that the world has made a great deal of progress since 1776, that we have had new thoughts and new experiences which have given us a great advance over the people of that day, and that we may therefore very well discard their conclusions for something more modern. Right? And of course, he's directly challenging progressivism there. the idea that what is more current is better than what is past. And remember, this is exactly what Wilson had said. We don't want to focus on the older sword. We only want to focus on the future. And we have to do that by evolutionary terms. That is, we discard the past as necessary then, but no longer necessary. Coolidge is directly challenging that progressive assumption that things are better now than they were. But that reasoning cannot be applied to this great charter. If all men are created equal, that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. If governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, that is final. Right? And this is where we recognize, if we say all men are created equal, there's no more argument. That's done. That argument is absolutely 100% done. Because we don't say then all men but Jews or all men but black men or whatever it may be. We recognize that all men are created equal and there can be no more argument. It is done. Now the only thing we have to do is make that true. That's all we have left. And that's why I told you guys earlier in the semester, I really believe that all of American history is the struggle to make the Declaration real. And it's very hard because we know that there's prejudice and we know that there's bigotry and we know that there's racism. We know all of those things. But our better nature calls to us, our better angels call to us and say, no, the argument's done. All men are created equal. And if all men are endowed with inalienable rights, there's no more discussion. We've made the argument and we cannot go anywhere from there except backwards. So notice again what Coolidge says here. No advance, no progress can ever be made beyond these propositions. If anyone wishes to deny their truth or their soundness, the only direction in which he can proceed historically is not forward, but backward, toward a time when there was no equality, no rights of the individual, no rule of the people. Those who wish to proceed in that direction cannot lay claim to progress. They are reactionary. Their ideas are not more modern, but more ancient than those of the Revolutionary Fathers. And again, and I hope that you guys feel the same way. There's just something so deeply, as he said, restful about this idea. We recognize that. And I will say this, and we were having this discussion in the other section, not in this section, but in the other one. And I think some of the students were feeling that I was being a little too anti-American when we were talking about imperialism. But imagine what we have with this argument. Once we as Americans have said all men are created equal, we have now achieved more than any other people have ever achieved. That makes us, that one statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That outside of the Bible is the greatest sentence ever written. And so here we have that truth, and we have to live up to it. And it's hard, but we have to do that. And so, I think we can be negative about America. When it comes to slavery, when it comes to American Indians, when it comes to imperialism, we can be negative about America. But if we're negative about the Declaration, we've fundamentally misunderstood who we are. This makes us the most interesting people who has ever existed. And so I believe that wholeheartedly, and I think that's what Coolidge is getting at here. Mary?
How do you balance then the imperialist approach versus an isolationist approach?
Well, it would probably, Mary, that's great. It's a great question. And we've seen it all the way back to Washington. Remember, all the way back to George Washington, entangling alliances with no one, but good relations with everyone. And so we see it's deeply rooted in the American tradition that we have either expansionism or we have isolationism. But again, this is probably too easy of an answer, and I will admit my own bias in this. I like what Reagan did. I think Reagan's foreign policy was the best foreign policy we ever had. And it's a foreign policy that says, we build the biggest military that has ever existed in the history of the world. But you build it so you never have to use it. The whole reason you're the most powerful country is because you don't want to use that power. But you don't want anyone messing with you either. And so I always felt like Reagan had this kind of perfect balance. We were neither isolationist, but we weren't imperialist either. It was something in between. And so there are certain areas where it's prudent that we attack, and certain areas that it's prudent that we leave alone. And that's what I think is important, and I think is what's missed if we only have isolationism or we only have imperialism. Mary, if you push me, Brad, on those things, I would probably, if I had to choose between those two, I would probably choose isolationism. But I don't know if that's healthy. I don't think it actually is. I think that we still have to be active participants in the world, but we have to be really prudent about it. So does that kind of help? Okay, good. But again, I'm giving you more my opinion than anything else on this. So, but I do think that we have that strain is so deeply rooted in us that we do one or the other. And imagine, think about something like NATO, right? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which we're a part of with 30 some other countries in Europe. When we first joined NATO, there were a lot of constitutional questions because the NATO charter says that if one country is attacked, all countries are attacked, and we're automatically at war. The Constitution doesn't allow for us to give that away, that right to declare war to some other people. So it's automatically NATO, even if it was very healthy and very good and very necessary, it's already in violation of the Constitution. So those are the kinds of things that we have to be really careful about. Where do we allow our sovereignty to be taken down? So even though I think NATO has done good overall, I think it's still a questionable thing just because of its very nature and what it does to our sovereignty overall. But I would say the same thing about the United Nations. I don't think we as Americans have any business being a part of that group at all, because we can't give away our sovereignty. It's not who we are. But that's not to say the United Nations hasn't done good things. They have. They've done very good things. So it's a hard problem for us. Yeah. Leon, did you have your hand up earlier?
Yes, I was going to ask how Coolidge would respond to the more modern liberal argument that they're not discarding, for example, the fact that all men are created equal. They're just reinterpreting it because the founders incorrectly did so.
Yeah, Coolidge, from my understanding, Coolidge would reject that because he's basically saying, no, they did understand it. They didn't know how to implement it, but they definitely understood it. And so when they say all men are created equal, they actually meant that. They just didn't know how to make it real. And so that's what American history is that playing out. And that's not different. I mean, if we look at a prominent black voice like Martin Luther King, the most important black man of the 20th century in America, most important American black man in the 20th century, right? What did he say? The Declaration is a promissory note, right? It's real. We just have to make it real, right? But it's true. We just have to make it real from that point forward. So, yeah, that's good. Okay, anybody else? So I want you guys to recognize this. And obviously I'm getting worked up about it, but I want you to realize this really matters. And Coolidge here is directly challenging progressivism in every way. And I think he wins. I mean, to me, the progressives don't have a foot to stand on after Coolidge has made this argument. But they do, obviously. They're still around. They're everywhere, probably more prominent than they've ever been. So they clearly are not defeated by this argument, even though I think in principle they are. But let's look at Coolidge. And I brought a book in today It's one of my favorite books, and I would encourage, if you guys have an extra, it's something you could read over 2 evenings this summer. It's just the autobiography of Calvin Coolidge. It's I think, one of the great works of American literature. And Coolidge is not only, and you can see this from what he just wrote, he's not only a good writer, but he's a very, very good thinker. And he's one of our last presidents to have had a liberal arts education. He went to Amherst College and got the same kind of education you guys are getting here, almost word for word, identical, kind of in the great books, in the great ideas, in the Western tradition. That's what Coolidge is raised in. And you can feel it, right? There are Latin and Greek bones in his body. That classical language is there. But here's what I want to note about Coolidge. Coolidge, and you guys have to, go 100 years ago, right? Just a simple 100 years ago. If any of us in this room in 1926, if we wanted to see the president, all we would have to do is go up to the White House door, knock, and ask the secretary for a president. There's no Secret Service. There's no fencing in front of the White House. It's the people's house. And that means that you have the right to go up and to be a part of that house. Think about how radically different that is today with the bulletproof glass and the fencing and the Secret Service. But only 100 years ago, I could have walked up to the front door of the White House and knocked and asked to see Mr. Coolidge. Right? He's just another citizen. He may be the most important citizen, but he's just another citizen. And that I find just I'm very taken with that. But Coolidge's background is interesting in and of itself too. He's a deeply honest man. And if you guys have noticed, I do not say that easily about politicians at all. My automatic view of politicians is that they are almost, and this is my failing, but I see them as almost always evil and basically just scum. So when I say that there's a good politician, you guys know I mean it, because they're just so rare. And yet we see Calvin Coolidge and the way that he rises in national politics to be the governor of Massachusetts, and then to be the vice president, and then to be the president. It's all deeply honest in the whole way that he moves up. And I love that story about him, that he really has done this great thing by just being himself. So I want to read to you what he says about himself becoming the president of the United States. And so I'm going to read from his autobiography. And okay, keep this in mind. Calvin Coolidge's mom dies when he's very young. His dad raises him. And his dad just owns the local grocery store. And he's a justice of the peace. And so there he is, his dad owns, and they're in New England. He owns the local country, just the local market. That's all he owns. And he does everything he can to make sure that Calvin gets a really good liberal education. So he drives him every day through the New England mountains, 30 or so miles to his academy, so that he can get a liberal arts education. That's how important it was to him. So the other thing to keep in mind is Calvin Coolidge's name, Calvin. He is named after John Calvin. And that's going to be very important to his story. He is a Calvinist. He believes very seriously in predestination. That is, he believes that God has shaped us for either heaven or hell. And so I want you guys to keep that in mind, or the story won't make sense. He's a deeply Christian man, but of a very Calvinist persuasion. Okay, here's what he says. And of the whole autobiography, he only devotes 2 chapters to the presidency. That's how unimportant the presidency was. It is a very old saying that you will never tell what you can do until you try. The more I see of life, the more I am convinced of the wisdom of this observation. Surprisingly, few men are lacking in capacity, but they fail because they are lacking in application. Either they never learn how to work, or having learned, they are too indolent to apply themselves with the seriousness and the attention that is necessary to solve important problems. Any reward that is worth having only comes to the industrious. The success which is made in any walk of life is measured almost exactly by the amount of hard work that is put into it. I hope you guys just feel that is so New England, that is so Calvinist, that is so puritanical, right? You just work really hard, and of course God will bless you, right? I wish it were that simple. I don't think it is, but he believes this very, very strongly. It has undoubtedly been the lot of every boy of the United States to be told that someday he could be president. Nearly every young man who happens to be elected a member of his state legislature is pointed by his friends and the local newspapers as being on the way to the White House. My own experience in this respect did not differ from that of others, but I never took such suggestions seriously, as I was convinced in my own mind that I was never qualified to fill the exalted office of the president. I had not changed this opinion after the November elections of 1919, when I was chosen governor of Massachusetts for a second term by a majority which had never been before exceeded. When I began to be seriously mentioned by some of my friends at the time as the Republican candidate for president, it became apparent that there were many others who shared the same opinion as to my fitness, which I had so long entertained. Right? You guys get, he's making fun of himself there. I love that, right? He's just said, I'm not fit to be president. And when people start talking about him being fit to be president, all these other people come out of the woodwork and say, yeah, you're not fit to be president, right? And Coolidge finds that hilarious. But with the coming national convention, acting in accord with the unchangeable determination, destiny came into my hands, and I was nominated for the vice president, right? And Harding is nominated for the president. Had I been chosen for the first place, I could have accepted it only with a great deal of trepidation. But when the events of August 1923 bestowed upon me the presidential office, I felt at once that grace had been given to me to administer it. This was not any feeling of exclusiveness. While I felt qualified to serve, I was well aware that there were many others who were also better qualified. It would be my province to get the benefit of their opinions and advice. Now I'm going to stop there for a second. I don't know if you guys know the story. Warren G. Harding, president, great president, actually, I think one of our best. He cut the budget in his first day in office by 69%. He just came in and just slashed. And basically, he returned our military immediately to all pre-World War I levels. He just cut everything across the board. But he was on a train in Alaska, and he suddenly got really sick, and then people thought he was going to be okay, and then he died. And nobody to this day, we don't know what caused it. He was on a train in Alaska, and he died. There was always speculation, and again, I'm not saying this is true, but we don't know it's not true, that his wife had poisoned him. They did not have the best relationship. So that's always a possibility, but we don't know. So, but he's going to be gone here. Now, here's Coolidge, right? I've just been made president by all of these accidents. And I would love for you guys to memorize this. Don't memorize it actually, but I love what he says here. It is a great advantage to a president and a major source of safety to the country for him to know he is not a great man. Just think about that. It is a major source of safety to a republic for a president to know he is not a great man. When a man begins to feel that he is the only one who can lead the republic, he is guilty of treason. Right? That's a very powerful statement. If a man thinks he's the only one to lead the republic, he's guilty of treason. He's become essentially Caesar. And so please note, Coolidge is taking down the presidency several notches. He doesn't want our president to be a king at all. Right? He is a citizen like you and me, and nothing beyond that. After President Harnig was seriously stricken, although I noticed that some of the newspapers at once sent representatives to be near me at our home, the home of my father in Plymouth, Vermont, the official reports which I received from the bedside soon became so reassuring that I believed all danger to President Harding was past. But then on the night of August 2nd, 1923, I was awakened by my father running up the stairs and calling my name. Now, I want to set the scene here. On the first floor is a grocery store. On the second floor is where Calvin Coolidge's dad lives. And on the top floor in the attic is where Calvin and his wife Grace are staying because they're visiting the father. They have no electricity at all. And electricity exists. This is 1923. But all the power in the house is by kerosene lamp. So no electricity at all. So again, just 103 years ago. That's all it is. Right? This is the time of your great-grandparents, 103 years ago, right? Experiencing this. So on the night of the August 2nd, 1923, I was awakened by my father coming up the stairs calling my name. I noticed that his voice trembled. As the only time I had ever observed that before was when death had visited our family, I knew that something of the gravest nature had occurred. His emotion was partly due to the knowledge that a man whom he had met and liked was gone, partly to the feeling that must possess all of our citizens when the life of a president is taken from them. But my father must have also been moved by the thought of the many sacrifices he had made to place me where I was, the 25-mile drives in storms and zero weather over the mountain roads to carry me to the Liberal Arts Academy, and all the tenderness and care he had lavished upon me in the 38 years since the death of my mother, in the hope that I might sometime rise to a position of importance. Now he realized it. He was the first person to address me as President of the United States. It was the culmination of a lifelong desire of a father for his son. He placed in my hands an official report and told me that President Harding had just passed away. My wife and I at once dressed. But before leaving the room, remember they're just in the attic of their dad's house. Before leaving the room, I knelt down, and with the same prayer with which I have since approached the altar of God, I asked God to bless the American people and to give me the power to serve them. My first thought was to express my sympathy for those who had been bereaved, and after that was done, to attempt to reassure the country with the knowledge that I proposed no sweeping displacement of the men then in office, and that there were to be no violent changes in the administration of affairs. As soon as I had dispatched a telegram to Mrs. Harding, I therefore issued a short public statement declaratory of my purpose. In the meantime, I had been examining my pocket constitution to determine what might be necessary for qualifying and taking the oath of office. It is not clear that any additional oath is required beyond that which is taken by the Vice President when he is sworn into office. It is the same form as that taken by the President. Having found this form in the Constitution, I set it on my typewriter, and the oath was administered to me by my father. I mean, can you imagine what is going on here? Right? We have just transferred one president to another in the attic of a man's house because the guy had a pocket constitution and he could take the oath of office to his dad. That's incredible. All by kerosene light. Just amazing to think about this. And think about what Coolidge did, right? His first act was to kneel and ask for God's grace to do this. The oath was taken in what we called the sitting room by the kerosene lamp. The Bible, which had belonged to my mother, lay at the table under my hand. It was not officially used in Vermont or Massachusetts, but I felt I wouldn't take my chances without it. Just incredible. So again, only 103 years ago, to imagine how different that is. Okay, last thing today. What happens? What's Calvin Coolidge think about his presidency? And here's where you guys have to keep in mind, and this is both beautiful and utterly painful. He is deeply a Calvinist. And so everything is predestined in a Calvinist Christian worldview. Everything, right? Fate rules. So, what's his final assessment of being President of the United States? My own participation was delayed by the death of my son, Calvin, which occurred on the 7th of July. He was a boy of much promise, proficient in his studies with a scholarly mind, who had just turned 16. He had a remarkable insight into things. The day I became president, he had just started working in a tobacco field. When one of his fellow laborers said to him, "If my dad were president, I would never work in this tobacco field," my son replied, "If my father were your father, you most certainly would." After he was gone, someone sent us a letter he had written about the same time to a young man who had congratulated him on being the first boy in the land, right? Just like the wife is the first lady, he's the first boy as the oldest son, Calvin, and congratulated him. To this, my son replied that he had done absolutely nothing to merit this title, and that title should go to some boy who had distinguished himself through his own actions. We do not know what might have happened to him under other circumstances, but if I had not been president, he would not have raised a blister on his toe, which resulted in blood poisoning and his death while he was playing tennis on the south grounds of the White House. In his suffering, he asked me to make him well. I could not. When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him. The ways of providence are often beyond our understanding. It seemed to me that the world had need of the work that my son would have done. I do not know why God exacted such a price for me to occupy the White House. It's just brutal, absolutely brutal, right? His arrogance at thinking he could be president resulted in the death of his son. That's how he viewed that. So that's what I want you guys to recognize. We have had truly good men as presidents, but they are very, very rare. They're so rare. And I will say this, and I'm speaking somewhat as Brad, but I think somewhat objectively as Professor Berzer. If we look at the history of the presidency, I think outside of the institution of slavery, which of course is off the charts in its wickedness, but I think that if we look at the Constitution objectively, the one thing that the founders truly failed at was creating the office of the presidency. We have had, out of 47 presidents, we've had probably 5 or 6 men who are actually worthy of the office. Most presidencies are a failure in almost every way, ruined by arrogance, ruined by hubris, but we see a couple that really were good. George Washington's the best. Abraham Lincoln, spectacular. Ronald Reagan, fantastic. Calvin Coolidge, very good. Dwight Eisenhower, very good. Grover Cleveland, very good. But otherwise, it's not a great institution. It's one of those institutions that has far more failure than success. But I want you guys to realize this. We now live in a world where the president is not only the predominating force in American government, he is the predominating force in the entire world. Nobody has as much power at his fingertips as the American president has. When you think about all the weaponry, all the nuclear weaponry that he has at his disposal, and the kinds of things that he can do, this is incredible. And yet it's clearly something the founders never anticipated at all. But you're going to have to deal with that the rest of your life, every one of you as an American citizen. This is going to be one of the most predominant features of your adult life, trying to recognize what the president is, what he should be or she should be, and what she shouldn't be. So just keep that in mind. But again, we've had great ones. Okay, guys, you have any final questions or any thoughts? Okay, I had asked you to read the Franklin Roosevelt pieces for today. And so I would like you guys for Monday, since we've got a weekend here, I would also like you to read the next 3 documents after Franklin Roosevelt there. So read the Truman Doctrine with Harry S. Truman, The Sources of Soviet Conduct by George F. Kennan, and NCS 68. So read those for Monday. All right, you guys have a great weekend. Be good. Go to church. And I'll see you on Monday morning.